What's up, my wizards? It's your boy Dev from Mtg. We like magic, and I gave Patreon 4 decks to vote on, but in the end it wasn't even close. One of these decks took nearly half of the vote by itself, so I guess you guys are excited about it. Today we're going to talk about Mono Black Control, aka Mastermind's Mastery. Ooh. Now, these decks are always super fun to build, not only because I get to play with one of my preview cards, playing 2 of this bad boy in the deck, but also because these are just cool decks to build. I like toolbox decks that play a lot of tutors. We get to play a lot of 1 and 2 ofs, but not too many 1 and 2 ofs. Got to keep the consistency right. It's just a fun deck building riddle to have to solve. And it's already been solved, actually. You know, one of the fringe decks of the last standard was the green-black Mastermind's Acquisition deck. That deck played Wildest Dreams out of its sideboard. Just use Acquisition to fetch it up in the late game, play it for 100, draw your entire graveyard for the most part, bury the opponent in card advantage. That's how those decks won. But I actually think that because of a new toy out of Dominaria, we don't have to play Wildest Dreams or any other color for that matter. And that new piece is actually, believe it or not, Lich's Mastery. Now, first and foremost, this card is in the sideboard. I just want to point that out. Flashing text right here, but in any case, I usually don't tell you about cards that are in the sideboard while I'm talking about the main deck. I think this is a first, but it's an important card, and with Acquisition, it might as well be in the main deck. And to be honest, I'd rather it be in the sideboard. That way, it's tucked away, safe, comfortable. You know, it's safe from things like duress and other discard effects, and we don't have to worry about drawing it in the early game against aggro, where it's more or less a dead draw anyway. We'll keep it safe, we'll keep it in the sideboard, we'll go get it when we need it, if we need it at all, for that matter. Now, I said something 20, 30 seconds back you might be puzzling over right now. That's when I said that this keeps us off of having to play Wildest Dreams anywhere in the deck. I actually think that it does, you know. The whole idea of Wildest Dreams is that super late in the game, you just get all the card advantage and force scoops out of your opponent, or you'll draw some sort of threat back from your graveyard to help you win the game. It's kind of the same way with Lich's Mastery. The most important piece of text on the card, aside from you can't lose the game, obviously, is the bit about, you know, whenever you gain life, you draw cards. So once we drop a Mastery, we can gain a butt ton of life off of a couple of the spells that we're playing in the deck and just bury the opponent in lots and lots of card advantage. The card just also fits in with the core philosophy of the deck. You know, this is a grindy deck that goes really, really, really late into the game, most times at least. And this card helps support that by just keeping you alive a lot longer than you have any business being alive. You know, you're mostly just going to be removing cards from your graveyard while this is in play. And then you'll move to cards in hand or lands that you have out or whatever. But by the time you drop this, you should have a pretty healthy looking graveyard to remove cards from just in case you need to when you take damage. So this just does everything this deck needed. You know, it helps us stay in the game longer, draws us all the cards. We need all of that. Lich's Mastery is the perfect piece. It's what this deck was waiting for all along. But we can not lose the game all we want. We actually have to win the game at some point. So let's look at all the big threats that we're playing as win conditions, starting with 1 copy of Demon Lord Bells and Lock. Now, Rockin' the Bells is actually pretty effective in this format. He is 6 whole mana. That's a lot, but a flyer of this size is crazy. He bowls over everything this side of Daragaz, lives to tell the tale, and usually does a couple of extra damage while he's at it, you know. Notably, he goes right through Lyra Dawnbringer, which is a very tough card to deal with right now. But even stuff like Glorybringer, Rekindling Phoenix, Aethersphere Harvester, even Zahid, you know, which is one of the only flying creatures, again, aside from Daragaz, that really takes out a Lyra. Even this can go through that. So this just like crushes most other flyers in the format. It's a huge threat. It's a 4-turn clock, very often a 3-turn clock that your opponent absolutely has to answer. And I haven't even mentioned that it gives you card advantage yet, or at least replaces itself. You might be bristling actually at the inclusion of this because it does damage to us and we're playing Mastery, but we won't play Mastery every single game. And even if we do have a Mastery out, this does 1 damage to us 90% of the time. That's just 1 card out of our graveyard. It's not a big deal. You know, just remove a card from our graveyard, we're done. And even if this does draw us extra cards, it's really not a big deal. If we have a Mastery out, again, we can just remove cards from our graveyard. But one thing, before I move on, I do want to point out, last thing here, is that we're playing like 10 different cards in this deck that are 4 CMC or higher. So it's somewhat likely, or at least more likely than it would normally be, that you'll draw extra cards off of this. And anytime you do that, it's just incredible. Replaces itself and draws you a card and is the biggest threat in the deck. I think we have to play at least 1 copy of Bells and Lock. I think that it just barely edges out other 6-mana threats like Tetsamok or Noxious Gearhulk that we could be playing. Now, we are playing another one-of legend that I'm really excited to talk about, and that's Josu Vess. I actually ended up liking this guy a good bit. You know, we're playing a couple of things that help us get really big mana in the relatively late game, so it's not actually that hard to kick a Josu Vess into play. And I have a few times, but I've only won the game off of him like one time. So heed my advice, don't play into Fumigate, especially don't play into Settle the Wreckage. You know, you don't have to kill them all at one time. So all I'm saying is be smart, which is a plan for most of this deck. This deck is relatively difficult to pilot, so just remember that. I'll talk about it during the power rankings again, but in any case, be very careful when you kick a Josu in. But you don't necessarily have to kick him. You know, if you just naturally draw this and you can play him on turn 4 or 5, he's a pretty good body with 5 toughness, which is a benchmark in this format. You know, it can block and kill Scarab God tokens, Godfarer's Gift tokens. It doesn't get killed by Chandra. There's just a lot of reasons why 5 toughness is way better than 4 toughness. And he's just a good threat on his own. You know, he can attack well, and he can brick wall defenses. Because, again, he's got a pretty big butt on him and a really high power. So, like I thought about Josu, you know, he's versatile. He's a decent piece whether you get him relatively early or you want to wait and kick him until late and you can just end the game. There's a lot of ways you can use this card. Now, I'm also going to play 3 Walking Ballista, and that should come as no surprise. I mean, it feels like this card is everywhere again. I mean, it's not in every deck in Standard, but it is really popular once again, and, you know, again, easy to see why. Walking Ballista does it all. You know, it kills small creatures in the early game. It's another form of removal. It, you know, it's a mana sink that's great if we're looking for ways to spend all of our mana on turns we don't draw particularly good cards. And if we get it late or off of an acquisition when we have all the mana in the world, then it just essentially ends the game right there. So Walking Ballista, another perfect card for the deck. I'm playing at least 3, and I'm looking for a 4th. I just don't know what to make room, honestly. I would play all 4 in the deck, but right now this deck list is relatively tight, so I'm just not sure how to make room. So I'm going to move on to the rest of the threats in the deck. None of these are quite as game-winning, but they are still very important, starting with the 2 copies of Gandhi, Lord of Luxury, that we're playing. I don't think anybody's going to argue that Gandhi is good. This card has actually seen a pretty decent amount of play since it first hit Standard, and it hasn't really let up since because the ETB trigger is so unbelievable. In terms of Enter the Battlefield triggers in Standard, I think this is in the top 3 or top 5. It's that good, you know? The deck looks a little bit light on win conditions, but that's because we have Gandhi to help steal win conditions if we need to. And most decks in Standard play some big silly thing they're leaning on to close the game out, and we'll take all of them with this, deny them from getting it so it feels like removal, and then give it to us. So, you know, Gandhi's good pretty much no matter how you want to slice it, but he's also a sturdy body on the ground. It's not going to do a ton of damage for you, but at least it's a decent blocker. That can make the difference sometimes. And finally, last creature in the main deck at least, is the 3 copies of Gifted Etherborn that we're playing, mostly because I wanted another threat against control, and I wanted another removal piece against aggro. And Gifted Etherborn fits both of those roles pretty well. Plus, he's got the lifelink, which is pretty good when you got a mastery out. Now, most of the rest of the deck is removal in some form or another. But before we get to that, I want to stop off and talk about the 3 copies of Azor's Gateway that we're playing. And this shouldn't be a surprise either. Most acquisition lists up to the present have featured at least 3, if not 4 whole copies of Gateway. Ours isn't any different. 1 mana is a great cost to see extra cards every single turn. Even if you have to discard them or exile them, you're still seeing way more cards than your opponent. And in the control matchup, that's important. This gets in, especially on the play. It'll get in under just about every counterspell in the format, next to Ceremonious Rejection and Spell Pierce. So it's very easy to drop this in the early game against control and actually have it resolve, at which point you'll see way more cards in them, and that's great, and it only costs the 1 mana a turn to do that. So all of that is my favorite stuff about Gateway, but we also have the chance to flip it over. Now, don't worry too much about transforming the card. It's not as important, even as it was just last season in these builds. So we have another big mana piece in our mana base now that we didn't have before, but if you do transform this at any point, it's huge mana, obviously. You know, you can use this to play Josu Vess Kicked or Walking Ballista or any of the big mana stuff that we're playing. So if you can flip this over, it's really delicious gravy, but don't necessarily worry about doing that. Just the fact that it helps us see a lot of cards at a really low cost, that's what I'm after. Now, as far as removal goes, we got a lot of it, man. We got almost 20 pieces of removal in this deck. If you count the Walking Ballista as removal, it's right at 20. So there's a lot of removal, but a lot of it is flexible. We'll get to those pieces in a second, but I want to talk about the basic removal package first, and that starts with the 4 copies of Fatal Push, 2 copies of Cast Down, and 4 copies of Vraska's Contempt. Now, I don't have to justify Fatal Push like at all. You know, there's a lot of very cheap creatures that'll just murder us, just maul us to death in the early game if we're not playing all 4 copies of Push. So I think we should probably do that, especially with Lionel Elves in the format. Yeah, all 4 Fatal Push, but Cast Down is also pretty good against aggro decks. You're not worried about too many legendaries in there, especially in the early game. And this can notably take out a Steel Leaf Champion before they can really do anything with it, which you're probably going to run into a lot. So Cast Down is at least worth the 2 of, but Vraska's Contempt, I think, is worth the 4 of. Obviously, this has great synergy with Lich's Mastery, because it just becomes even more absurd. You know, drawing 2 cards when you cast a Contempt is unbelievable. But aside from that, I just think it's the right choice, period, in this format, to play 4 Vraska's Contempt. I think we have reached that point. I think 4 is the right number. There are even more big dumb threats in the format now than there were in the last format. You know, we've got all the stuff I named earlier. You know, Hazaret, Scarab God, Rekindling Phoenix, all of that and more to worry about. But now we've also got Lyra Dawnbringer and Teferi to go with the Chandras and stuff we already knew about. So I think Vraska's Contempt is even better than it's ever been. Plus the added synergy with Mastery, all for no-brainer in my mind. But some of our other removal in this deck isn't quite as basic and can serve other functions if we're not necessarily playing against aggro at the time. We're playing 3 copies of Doomfall and 2 copies of Battle at the Bridge to that end. Now, Doomfall, I think, is really, really good. I've always thought that. It's good against aggro and mid-range decks for getting the Hazarets and Phoenixes and stuff out of their hand before they ever have a chance to play them, regardless of whether or not we're on the play or the draw. That's important. This is also good against control decks, though, which, again, we don't have the best game 1 against, so it's good to have a main deck piece or 2 that allows us to get, you know, counter spells out of their hands so we can land, you know, game-winning plays that we want to land, and also removal pieces. You know, we do land a Bells Unlock, they can just cast Seal Away on it. Well, if we have a Doomfall, we can get that out of their hand, too. So there's a lot of reasons to play Doomfall right now. I think it works against 2 radically different decks that both of which we aren't great against. Now, as far as Battle at the Bridge, this has always been a better removal piece than anyone's given it credit for. I think this is a very underappreciated card, but it's especially great in this deck. These acquisition decks always played it, because in the late game, a Battle at the Bridge can just gain you all the life and affect the board. But in this deck, now we have Lich's Mastery, which makes Battle at the Bridge one of the best cards in the entire deck. So if we have a Mastery out, we can obviously kill a guy, gain a ton of life, and draw like 7 or more cards fairly easily, especially in the late game when we have our real mana production going. We can sometimes draw 15 cards off of this, and that's exactly where you want to be. Battle at the Bridge is easily one of the better cards in this entire deck, mostly because Lich's Mastery is around, but even if it weren't, I might still play Battle. It's that good of a card. It can kill Hazarets and Ronuses and other indestructible creatures, and for a good bit of mana, this scales really well. You know, for 6 mana it kills a Lyra, which you will do some of the time. For 5 mana it kills a Glorybringer, which you will do. But just for 3 mana, it kills a great deal of creatures in the format and keeps you in the game. But mostly, you're looking to cast this on turn 12 when you have a Mastery out, keep you in the game, really put it away for you. You won't necessarily force a scoop, but when you kill their best guy, gain 6 or 7 life, and draw a grip full of cards, there's really not much coming back from that. And we'll finish off the removal with our mass removal. I think it's right to play 2 sweepers in the main deck and at least 1 more in the sideboard. But as far as our main deck sweepers, I've gone with 1 copy of Bantu's Last Reckoning and a copy of Phyrexian Scriptures. Now, Bantu's, I actually think, is the better sweeper here all in all because it immediately sweeps the board for less mana initially. Phyrexian Scriptures just barely makes the cut over Yeheni's Expertise or a second main deck copy of Last Reckoning because there's just enough cool stuff you can do with this. That first lore counter works really well with Walking Ballista, should at least point that out, but it works well with our other creatures too. You know, we can get a 3/4 Etherborn and leave it as the only creature on the battlefield. That's a good play. And Demon Lord, you know, leaving it as the only creature in play, 7/7 Flying Trample, that's a great play too, but this works well with the Scrappy Scrounger that's in the sideboard. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do with Scriptures that make it just worth playing, in my opinion. But we'll finish off the main deck here with the couple of copies of Duress that we're playing. Along with Doomfall, this actually gives us a pretty decent Game 1 plan against control decks, or at least a lot more options than we normally have Game 1 against them. But Duress is good against other stuff than just control. Sure, it gets counterspells and removal and all kinds of stuff out of their hand, but it also gets Godfarer's Gift and Gate to the Afterlife out of a gift player's hand, and things like, Cast Out, Seal Away, Ixalan's Binding, gets rid of that nonsense. There's just all kinds of stuff that Duress can nab for us. Whether or not we're playing against control, this has a lot of game right now, so I think it actually is worth a couple of main deck slots. Now, the sideboard's really important in this deck, but I will stop off for a second and discuss the lands, which we're playing 26 of. It seems like a lot, but this is essentially, effectively, a control deck that needs to hit its drops, and it's playing a lot of high CMC stuff, so we need all of the mana, that we can possibly get to. We've got some stuff in this deck that costs so much, or we can just pump all the mana we want into that. Land drops almost never feel like dead draws. Plus, we've got Azor's Gateway in the deck, so it's nice to be able to exile a land or two if we don't need them to that card. It takes the pressure off a little bit from making really hard decisions with Azor's Gateway, so that's another reason to play a lot of lands. Now, the most important land in here is obviously Cabal Stronghold. This is one of the big reasons not to want to play Wildest Dreams or any other colors of cards in this deck, is because we want to play all of the swamps for this thing right here. In the late game, this is a much more reliable way of getting all the mana than having to transform an Azor's Gateway. And again, takes the pressure off of thinking you even have to in the first place. Once we get 7 or 8 swamps, which will happen if things go the way we've drawn them up. The game will go very long, and this will just translate into tons and tons of mana for kicking that Jozu Vest or playing that Walking Ballista or whatever you need. It's actually really, really reliable, far more reliable than Gateway ever was. But that's not all. You may notice we're playing the Field of Ruin and the Memorial to Folly, which may look a little weird because we just want all of the swamps for Cabal Stronghold. But Field of Ruin, I think, is important because it still represents swamps. It can go fetch up swamps for us. I think that's a negligible argument when it comes to, Cabal Stronghold. This is still effectively swamps in the long run. And it hits Revolt for your Fatal Push. So I think Field of Ruin should definitely still be in the deck. And the Memorial to Folly is specifically for really Walking Ballista, but you can also get back a Bells Unlock or Jozu Vest and try to kick it again with Memorial to Folly, but mostly it's for the Walking Ballista because it's particularly nasty with Memorial to Folly. Now let's talk about the sideboard, and you may have noticed that I'm still showing my face, and I don't usually do that. But again, the sideboard might as well be the main deck in this deck because we're running Acquisition, and so many of our sideboard pieces are important regardless of whether we're in Game 1 or 2. So I've already shown you Lich's Mastery. Let me show you another one of in the sideboard that can just win the game. Honestly, this one's a big deal. Torment of Hailfire. I was surprised this card was like $4. I don't know why it is, but in any case, it is. But I still want to play at least the one copy of it. This is just a card that if we acquisition for it in the late game, win on the spot. It's actually even more capable of winning on the spot than a card like Walking Ballista would be. So that's pretty important. But just like Mastery, I don't want to run the risk of drawing this early against aggro or anything. At that point, it's just dead. For a lot of the game, gums up our hand. We could have better options. So I'd like to tuck it away into the sideboard where, again, it's safe and we can just acquisition for it whenever we need it. I'm also playing a copy of Sentinel Totem. Again, I don't necessarily like the idea of wiping all the graveyards, but I still want the ability to do it against decks that really, really need their graveyard, especially gift decks and stuff. So I think it's worth playing at least one Sentinel Totem here. I'm also going to play another copy of Bantu's Last Reckoning. I just wanted a third sweeper for games 2 and 3, and that's pretty much the size of it. You could also play Yahenni's Expertise if you wanted to, but there's really not a whole lot of cards in the deck, besides removal that we're playing, that you can cast for free off of Expertise. So I think that Reckoning is probably, if we're going to play a third sweeper in the board, and I think we really should, I think Reckoning is probably the best. I'm also going to play a one of Lilliana in this sideboard. This isn't the best card in the world. Honestly, it doesn't have any synergy with Walking Ballista in this deck, and I really wish that it did, like Magic Origins Lilliana did. That would be just great, but this doesn't. But this can still get back a Bells Unlock or Josie Vest if we needed to. And then I love the flavor of getting back Liliana's brother with Lilliana. That seems great. But aside from that, this is also a creature factory, which this deck wants, and the ultimate is great too, just sort of another sweeper on ultimates. So there's a lot I like about Lilliana, and I want access to at least the one copy of her somewhere in the deck. Now the rest of this sideboard is pretty much all anti-control options, and so with that in mind, let's start with the 4 copies of Scrappy Scrounger and the 3 copies of Dread Shade. That's right, Dread Shade. Now, Scrappy Scrounger doesn't need too much of an introduction. This is obviously really annoying against control, and once we sideboard, we'll have a lot more creatures that we can actually use to bring this back. Even if you only bring it back once against control, that's headache enough. Control really hates Scrappy, but it's not enough to beat control on its own, but it is a great piece against blue-white control. The Dread Shade, a little bit harder to explain here, obviously. It looks a little bit out of place, but I wanted more threats against control. I wanted a lot of threats against control. You know, we're going to have to side out a lot of our removal in that matchup, so we need to be able to put in more creatures, and Dread Shade is a pretty good one. This can hit for as much as 7 the turn after you play it, if you played it on curve, so they absolutely have to do something about it, or they're just dead. This can take over a game in a hurry, force removal, or just force chump blocks until they eventually die from it. You know, again, there just has to be removal for Dread Shade or they're done. So I think it's actually one of the more cost-effective pieces we could put in the deck, and it goes pretty well with all of our mana production. If we do flip over a gateway, we have a Cabal Stronghold and a bunch of swamps, Dread Shade's pretty good in that sitch too, so I'll take a few copies of him. And the last bits of anti-control stuff, and the last of the board in general, is the 2 copies of Duress and the 1 copy of Doomfall, just so we can finish up these play sets. They're both extremely effective against control. Shouldn't have to tell you that. Let's make sure that we have 4 of them in the 75. Just realized that this cord's been hanging here like this probably most of the video. The heads-up display on my camera covers it up, so I couldn't see it, but you probably noticed that. I apologize. But in any case, earlier I talked about some cards that I thought about playing instead of Azor's Gateway. Let me talk about those real quick. The first of these is Dark Bargain. I didn't think about this card for too long, to be honest. I do think this is a great piece, to be honest. I think some blue decks would love this effect, especially once Glimmer of Genius leaves the format. This doesn't look like a bad piece of instant speed card draw, but ultimately I felt like Azor's Gateway was better for this deck. But the real decision was actually whether to play Gateway or Urza's Tome, believe it or not. Now, I think there's some cool things about Tome, but what scared me off of it, ultimately, was the 3-mana activation cost. That is astronomically high. It's really high. Azor's Gateway, it's only the 1 mana to activate. I think that makes the difference here. But obviously with Tome, you don't have to worry about exiling cards. You just discard them. And what's cool about that, by the way, is that with Lich's Mastery, each card in our graveyard is essentially more life. It's a higher life total for us. So being able to discard rather than exile is actually kind of important. Plus, we're playing, Memorial to Folly and Lilliana, so we could easily discard creatures to Urza's Tome and then just get them back later through reanimation. There's also the fact that we're playing a bunch of historic cards in this deck. So we could discard something to Urza's Tome and then the next turn, just remove it from our graveyard so we don't technically lose a card at all. So I think that Urza's Tome is an interesting inclusion, but I'm just really worried about the 3-mana activation. I think that is a bit high, but I think there are arguments for it, is all I'm saying. Now it's time to look at some power rankings. The final score of 66, and really, this looks like a control deck in the box score. Pretty low speed, especially in this deck, but a very high defense. Similar game 1 and board, especially in this deck, because our board kind of is our main deck. So it's almost the same match, game 1 and board. And we're fairly consistent. We're just the 1 color. We draw a good amount of cards, so that keeps the consistency high, even though we're playing a bunch of 1 and 2-ofs. We're still a pretty consistent deck. Now, with all that said, though, this is definitely a thinking person's deck. This deck requires smart play. It's a little tough to pilot because it's going to force a lot of decisions on you, especially when you actually cast Acquisition. You have to know what you're going for, and sometimes that can be radically different depending on the situation. This deck does require a lot of patience and a lot of decision making, but that just makes it extremely rewarding in the end when you do land that, huge battle at the bridge that kills their guy, draws you all the life, and gets you a grip of cards, and they just have to deal with that. It's extremely satisfying, but again, the deck is somewhat difficult to pilot, but again, just rewarding for that. And if you're interested in either viewing this deck list or just ordering the deck outright because you want to play it, just click the very first link in the description box down there, the old doobly-doo, just hit show more. The first link will take you over to my sponsors at TCG Player where you can nab this deck for the cheapest price online. Some places you're going to pay like $250, $275 for this thing. You know, especially with the prices of some of these cards. They're just wildly variant on some sides. But TCG Player, you can get this deck for about $200 right now, which is actually not a bad price for as many powerful pieces as we're playing. It's a fun deck. It is challenging, but again, because it's so challenging, it's really rewarding, and it is for a very specific kind of player. If you're that player, click the link in the description, head over to them, check the deck out. I'll also leave you a link down there for Patreon if you feel like helping out. You don't have to, but just for $1 a month, you get to participate in all of these polls, and I'll let you know what decks we're doing the day before we do them. So like 10 to 12 times a month, I'll let you know what decks we're doing, and you get to be in polls and vote on decks and stuff. And that's all for $1 every 30 days. Pretty good deal. If you want to do $5 a month, I'll send you a signed card. But all I really ask is $1 helps out more than you could possibly imagine. So if you've got the scratch, head on over to the link. And I'm pretty sure I'm tapped out for now. You just got to do all the other YouTube stuff for me. You know, click like if you enjoyed the video, or even if you didn't. Click like, super low effort way to help. You can also follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev, and you can subscribe. That you should also do that. Make sure you hit the bell so YouTube lets you know when I put new videos out, or else it more or less defeats the purpose of subscribing. So subscribe, ring the bell. We're trying to get to 100K. I can smell it. I want that play button so badly. I'll put it right there. But in any case, just hit subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff for me, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.